Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Valkyrien Skies Clockwork, which combines Valkyrien Skies and everybody's favorite mod, the Create mod, is finally available in a public alpha version, which you can go find on their Discord, linked down below. With Valkyrien Skies, you can go really in-depth with a lot of the features, and you can make some really incredible things. But for today's video, we're just going to take a look at how to make your very first plane. Now there is a whole lot more we can do with this mod. We can make airships, we can make boats, and I'm thinking we can even make cars. So make sure you subscribe to stay tuned to look at all the different fun things we do with Valkyrien Skies Clockwork. Now the very first thing we need to get our contraptions into kind of a live state is the physics infuser. Essentially what this block does is when you right click it once and then twice, it turns into a living block almost. So it'll actually have physics. It'll infuse physics into the block. Now, once you have that block made, you can actually just right click on that block and you can build in what I'm just going to refer to as plane space, as I haven't seen anybody call it really anything yet. So we're just going to call this plane space. Now, if you want to infuse physics into something before you actually make it live, what you can do is you can build whatever you want to build, and then use this new item, blooper glue. Right click it on one corner, right click on the other, just like using super glue in the Create mod. And then when you make your physics, it will actually all be connected together automatically. Now some really cool things about this, unlike other Create contraptions where when it's live, you kind of really can't do anything with it, it's kind of almost non-existent. In plane space, you can actually fully interact with any blocks or items. So I place a crafting bench here, and I could actually go into a crafting inventory. And another really cool thing is, let's say you build your big contraption in plane space, you can actually go in here with a schematic, and you can make a schematic in plane space and save that, which is super cool. Now one thing to keep in mind when you're building your first contraptions is different blocks have different weights. So when I go ahead and make this live, you'll see that it'll tip over to the side because the netherite block is a lot heavier than the grass block. Now once you have your contraption in plane space, to actually move this around, we want to grab a Gravitron. So this is a brand new item added by the mod, and by right clicking on any kind of live object, we can actually pick it up and fully move it around. Now, as of yet, I don't think there's any controls to pull this in or kind of push it out further or rotate it. So right now it's kind of can be a little bit tricky to use. But one tip I would definitely give you is if, let's say, we needed to flip this over, if we look down, it's going to stay relative to how we were looking. So then if we go ahead and look up, we can then rotate it. And you can see it does actually collide with like walls and stuff as you're moving it around. Can be kind of glitchy, and I would definitely be careful because a few times when moving stuff around, I have actually pushed myself and the plane I'm working through down into the void under the world and lost everything. So be very careful when you're moving stuff around with the Gravitron because it can be dangerous. The next thing we're going to take a look at is how to actually get some momentum going in our contraption, and that's going to be using the Propeller Bearing. So the Propeller Bearing essentially works with sails. So basically you're going to put your sails down, and depending on the amount of sails and the speed you spin it at, you're going to get a different kind of velocity forwards. So I'm going to go ahead and place some sails there, and then we're going to infuse this with physics. So now that we have physics on this, we're ready to go. So we have our propeller bearing hooked up. We want to actually right click it, and that will kind of put it in a live state. Oh, there it goes. So you can see you definitely want to make sure that you're managing your speed and number of propellers well, because it can very easily get out of hand. And one thing I would definitely recommend is you can actually right click the propeller bearing to turn it on and off. But I would probably recommend using a clutch, because then you can leave it your bearing on all the time and just kind of use your clutch to toggle it on and off. So let's go ahead and actually slow this way down because it moves a lot faster than expected. Right click that, and now we can see moving at a slightly more reasonable rate, but still quite quick. And then of course this will absolutely slow down as we add more weight. So for example, we're going to go ahead and add 2 netherite blocks. You can see we're not actually moving until I give it a little bit more speed. Still not moving. A whole lot more speed. Still moving very, very slowly. So if your contraption is moving too fast or too slow, look at reducing or increasing the weight, as well as changing the speed and number of propellers. So now that we have horizontal motion, we want to try to get some lift, and that's going to be done with the flat bearing. So the way the flat bearing works is if you apply a signal to one side, it will kind of turn to that side, and then if you apply a signal to the other side, it will turn to that side, and that's going to be based off the RPM you input. And I would actually recommend having this really low, because that'll kind of allow you to get a little more control over how your plane moves. Now on its own, the flat bearing isn't going to actually do anything, but the flaps themselves are what's actually going to provide the lift. So we have this little contraption in plane space here, and before you actually get these going, you do need to superglue them together. So I've superglued all these flaps together, and then when you right click the flat bearing, they will kind of go live. And the way you can tell that they're live is you can see when they're not, I can hover over them and I get the little hitbox, and then when they are, I no longer see that hitbox. So now when I go ahead and activate this, you can see our flap moves one way and then the other, and we can use this as we're moving forward to generate lift up or down or side to side, however we want. So now that we can control our plane forward, back, up and down, we do need a way to kind of make it glide, and that's going to be using the wings. So the way wings work is once they're in plane space and you go ahead and place them down, they kind of float almost like a piece of paper. So they kind of don't add really buoyancy, I would say, but they do kind of add like a bit of a floaty effect. So if you're ever having troubles with your plane, it's not really maintaining its altitude or its speed, try adding some more wings, and that kind of might help it float down or keep its kind of horizontal height a little bit better. And then to power this whole thing, we do actually have this new block, the combustion engine. However, I haven't gotten this to work and I haven't seen any information out there yet. Please remember this is early access, so at some point that will be updated and I will have a video kind of showing that off so you guys can power your planes without using a creative motor. And speaking of power, the last thing we're going to take a look at before we start getting our plane together is the Redstone Resistor. And now this is really cool. So essentially what this does is allows you to take an RPM, and without the need of a whole rotational speed controller setup, you can reduce speed. This can't increase speed, but we can reduce it. So if you have a 256 RPM, and we apply a little bit of strength, you can see we go down to 204. And the way this works is based on the strength. You can see our dial going down here. So the higher redstone strength we input into our redstone resistor, the less RPM we're going to get out the other side. So this works really well if you want to have one motor controlling everything. So you can have a fast speed for your propeller, but then you can have a slow speed for your flaps just with a single block, which is really helpful. And putting that all together, I have my very first plane design. Now I do have the schematic linked for this down below, however I would definitely recommend watching this next section as there's a little more setup you need to do before you can start flying around with your plane. So before we get it all set up to run, I'm just going to run over how this all works. So first things first, we have a motor down here running at 128 speed, which is what we're running our propellers at to get kind of a good total speed. That comes up here to a clutch, and then our propeller bearing is in front of that. The reason we want the clutch here is so that way we can use this redstone link and then this to turn that clutch on and off, so that way we can actually stop our plane wirelessly. I would definitely recommend having this hooked up to your propeller, because if you don't, it is possible that your plane will just fly off in the distance and you'll never see it again. Moving back from our propeller, we have our two main wings. So this section here is all wings, and then this section back here is all flaps hooked up to our flat bearing. Now our flaps are hooked up to a single redstone strength to really slow them down as much as possible, and we have quite sizable flaps on the side so that way we can kind of turn. And the way I have our controls set up for this is they're kind of kitty corners, so you can see our light blue die is here and here, and our light green die is here and here. And the reason for that is because we're actually not using these to go up and down, we're using it to roll. Because the way we're going to want to fly this is we're going to roll to the right and then kind of move up, and that's how we would move to the right, and then opposite for moving to the left, which you guys will see in just a minute once we get flying. And then moving on to the back here, we do have this wing here, and that's just kind of for stabilization, so that way as we're turning, we're not kind of flipping our tail back and forth. And then finally we have another set of flat bearings, which are run off of this shaft here, again at that lower speed, where we have just a few flaps here, and then a few more wings in the back, just to provide a little bit of extra lift on the rear end. Now, one final thing I want to mention is I did have to put this stone brick slab here because our balance was a little bit off, and as we were flying, our nose kept going up. So to fix that, I just added a little bit of weight to the back, and that seemed to solve our problem. And here is how I have the linked controller set up. Now, just some real basic tips and tricks for kind of getting your plane going. First things first, I would definitely recommend having a seat. The command seat, which is actually added by Valkyrien Skies Clockwork, works pretty well. But you can also just use the regular seats from Create, and they will also work pretty well on Contraption. The second thing is if you press F3 and B, it'll show hitboxes, which will actually kind of show you the whole area your plane tapes up. And what's also really cool is we might not be able to see it in here because it might be hidden. But if I go ahead and take a look at this piece, we'll always see this little yellow cube, and that will actually show the center of mass. So let's actually see if we can't maybe find it in here somewhere. Yeah, so it's right here. So you can see our center mass is right about here, and that's going to be really important to kind of make sure that first off it's centered along like this axis, because if it's not, then you're going to be tilting to the side. And you also want to make sure it's kind of like relatively in the center of your plane, so that way you're not going to be tipping forward or back too much. Another really nice tip is all of the andesite casings and other Create blocks have very low weight. So I actually built this whole thing out of andesite casings versus wood or anything else, just because it gives me so little weight added that we could make this whole plane and make it balance really nicely and only need a few propellers to actually drive this whole thing. And then the last tip I definitely want to give is have some landing gear, because without the landing gear, we're kind of starting flat. And when you're starting flat, it's hard to get that first little uplift. So by having the landing gear here, as soon as we start moving, we're already kind of starting to get a little bit of uplift from the wings. And then once we actually engage our tail to start kind of bringing us up, we're able to kind of shoot off into the sky really, really easily. So if you guys have any more tips you want to give as you start digging into this mod, please leave a comment down below. I'll pin anything that I think is really helpful, so that way we can all kind of work together to learn this mod, as it's very, very new, and things will be changing in it very, very fast. So now it's time to actually get this thing into plane space, get it all glued together, and take our first flight. So our first step is we need to apply blooper glue to the whole thing. So I'm just going to go ahead and right click on that corner, and then right click on this corner. You can see now it's all glued. Now I can go ahead and destroy all of this wool at this stage. Go ahead, place my physics infuser, right click it twice, and our plane is now active. Now the next step we need to do is we need to fix our flat bearings. So you can see they actually kind of messed up a little bit here. Now the reason they did that is because we didn't have these glued together yet. So we need to take regular super glue, glue the swing together, and then reactivate each one of the flat bearings. And that will make our little flaps all one piece and make us ready to fly. So we'll do 1, 2, 3, and 4, and we should be ready to fly. Now one last thing, this is a little bug that I've noticed with this, is when we made this live, this shaft is right now being powered by nothing. So you do have to come in here, break the shaft to fix it, and then go ahead and place this cog back down because it did pop itself off, and then place down our andesite casing, and then place our powered toggle latch back. Now the last step we need to do on our plane is right click our propeller bearing to make that live. Go ahead, sit in our seat, grab our linked controller, open our doors, and we're off. As long as we don't crash, that is. And take 2. Oh no. And take 3, and we're off. So as you can see, this mod is certainly early access, but it's also certainly a lot of fun. And take, what is this for? Take 6. And we're off. Okay, and finally we're in flight. So, as you can see, to actually kind of turn, what I'm doing is I'm actually rolling our plane, and then I'm just kind of like tilting it up, and that kind of gets us that turning motion, and it all works actually pretty smooth. I'd say the one downside and one problem that I might have to fix yet is as you're doing the turning motion, you do kind of drop a little bit, but I don't think that's the end of the world, because realistically, if you're doing that sharp turns, that should be relatively infrequently, and it could be fixed by removing the stone slab kind of like on the nose. But yeah, it all kind of works pretty smoothly. Could even potentially speed up the plane a little bit by just increasing that propeller speed. And with that, I think that's going to be it for today's video. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, there's a lot of really cool stuff we can do with this mod. I think next we'll probably look at building some airships so we can take a look at the balloons added to the mod and kind of see how that all works together. In the meantime, I hope you guys have a fantastic time at making your crazy planes and airships, and I'll be seeing you next time. Bye-bye.